It is essentially an experiment in trying to sustain a novel-length piece of writing almost exclusively on the quality of its prose. This is Speedboat by Renata Adler. Renata Adler was born in Italy, but she was raised in Connecticut. She is most well known probably for her work as a journalist, a non-fiction writer, an essayist. She was a staff writer for The New Yorker for decades. But she did write 2 novels, this being one of them, probably the most famous of the 2. It's one of my favorite books of all time. Her other novel, Pitch Dark, which I will talk about a little bit more later, is also worth reading, but I would say that this is definitely the preferred starting point if you've never encountered her writing before and want to start getting into it. Speedboat came out in 1976. As I said, it was her first novel. It won a Hemingway Award, I believe it was, when it came out. Either way, it was quite critically acclaimed, although what I would say as a caveat to that is that Adler is very much a writer's writer in the sense that her focus and intention, especially in writing this novel, is really about sentence formation and craft and writing in its purest form. And I think sometimes it can be a little bit challenging or difficult to get into if what you're looking for or what you're used to reading is more narrative. This book is essentially plotless. It's quite aimless. It's very fragmented. It's built up of a series of disconnected fragments. So they're pieces that range from 1 or 2 sentences to paragraphs and sometimes, a page or half a page around that length. But for the most part, the events that occur in these fragments are totally disconnected. There are some recurring characters every once in a while. The most recurring character, of course, being the narrator of the book, Jen, who is very much based on Adler and her own personal life. I would call this book autobiographical, which I'm just realizing now seems to be a theme in the work that I really enjoy, which is maybe something that I need to consider and think about a little bit more deeply. Anyway, Adler's own life is the basis of inspiration for this book, and Jen's character is also a writer, a journalist living and working in New York. The cool thing that Adler does in this book, in the same way that maybe someone like Lucia Berlin does in A Manual for Cleaning Women, is that she refracts her own private experience through the lens of fiction. Because this book is so fragmented and non-linear, it's a little bit difficult to describe it from a plot perspective, outside of saying that it essentially covers several years in this woman Jen's life as she is trying to navigate and make sense of adulthood and her career and relationships. I think it's one of those cases where rather than trying to describe exactly what happens and the way that she writes, I would prefer to actually read some passages out and then discuss from there. I think when you are truly stuck, when you have stood still in the same spot for too long, you throw a grenade in exactly the spot you were standing in and jump and pray. It is the momentum of last resort. Some people get a jump on the morning in other ways, speeding on the highways, making money, doing crossword puzzles, a darker tan, a whiter wash, accumulations of various kinds. That passage illustrates a couple different things really well. Number one, it illustrates the register and tone of her writing really well. She has an incredibly observational voice, especially in this book. It feels a little bit essayistic. It feels quite grounded in reality because I think obviously so much of it is based on her own observations and reflections as a writer and a human being. She rides this amazing line between feeling poetic and feeling direct and legible. That's this skill that I really admire and something that I'm trying to emulate in my own writing, but I find really, really difficult, which is probably no surprise because Adler is a master of that. The other thing that this passage starts to elucidate is some of the thematic content of this book. I think because it's so nonlinear and so devoid of plot and so loosely structured, you tend to grab onto anything that feels recurrent as you're reading it. And one of the devices that she uses in favor of plot is persistent theme. She tries to thread particular ideas or notions throughout the text that kind of take the place of a narrative thread. And one of these themes, at least to me, has to do with ennui. It has to do with boredom and desperation and feelings of discomfort that are quite mild, let's say, and not based on severe circumstances. So it's not necessarily a reaction to death or great suffering, but it has to do with the ebb and flow of melancholy that sits below the surface of everyday life. And that to me is, number one, really relatable. Obviously, I think that's probably relatable for a lot of people, but the way that she approaches it is really spectacular, because that feeling is quite nebulous and ephemeral, and trying to capture it in writing is really challenging. And what she has attempted to do here is, rather than spell it out or attack it head on, she's attempting to build this slow accumulation of feelings and moments that all add up to this one particular feeling. We may win this year, we may lose it all. It is not going as well as we thought. Posterity, anyway, does not know everything. The simplest operations of life, voting in a booth, filling out returns, remembering whether or not one has just taken a pill, are very difficult. Jim leads an exemplary life, and I can't cook. As is clear from the parking regulations, however, there are situations in which you are not entitled to stop. I also love this thing that Renata Adler does, which is evident in that passage I just read, which is to combine things that feel really big from a scale perspective with things that feel really small. So she will have one sentence that is dealing with something quite monumental or theoretical, and then immediately after she will land in a sentence that is much more mundane and minute. And I really like this relationship that she's making between the big and the small, and the significant and the seemingly insignificant. She treats both with the same level of irreverence, I would say. She does not approach either with sentimentality, but rather takes them for what they are, and feels that the two are connected, that the big things in our life and the small things in our life exist side by side and aren't necessarily intended to be separated or treated that differently. There are a lot of references in this book to missed exits and feeling lost. And this, I think, is one of the big themes here that does accumulate slowly through time. So much of what this book is doing successfully has to do with two things, which is, number one, Adler's sense of voice, and number two, her sense of observation. This feels like the journal of somebody who is constantly looking at the world around them, and the feelings that they feel in relation to that world around them are not necessarily things that she spells out explicitly, but are rather insinuated or suggested through the symbols and imagery of her observations. That kind of writing to me is incredibly difficult to achieve. And the fact that this book not only does that so well, but that it does essentially nothing else is pretty spectacular. This book is, in a lot of ways, kind of an experiment in how far you can push the boundaries of narrative and still write an engaging novel without relying on plot or narrative through lines like we typically would expect of a novel. It is essentially an experiment in trying to sustain a novel-length piece of writing almost exclusively on the quality of its prose. And I would say that Adler almost miraculously succeeds. It's about feeling lost. It's about surviving melancholy. It's about attempting to make sense of things that feel inherently chaotic. It's about trying to find meaning in the mundane. And at the same time, it's also about trying to let go of all of those attempts to do something and appreciate what's in front of you, whether or not that's actually the resolution for the narrator in the book, Jen, it feels like the resolution for me, in the sense that the form of the book, the structure of it, is such a celebration of language and observation and the minute details of regular life that you can't help but feel like that is kind of a thesis in a way. And that Adler, maybe even accidentally, is suggesting to us that all of these attempts to find our way out of feelings of hopelessness and desperation and loss are beside the point. You can't miss it always means you're never going to find it. The shortest distance between 2 points may well be the wrong way on a one-way street. All the same, I think there's something to be said for assuring the next that the water's fine. Quite warm, actually, once you get into it. You can't miss it. It could be that the sort of sentence one wants right here is the kind that runs and laughs and slides and stops right on a dime. This, to me, is still one of the best ending sequences of any book I've ever read. I love the way that she starts the sequence by saying, you can't miss it always means you're never going to find it. And then goes on to give us advice and essentially reassure us that the water's warm, which I take to mean that everything's okay, that it will be all right, that there's no reason to worry. And then immediately afterwards, she ends it by saying, you can't miss it. It has this really ironic quality to it. It's funny. It's a little bit cynical as well, in the sense that she recognizes the futility of trying to be reassuring or helpful, but at the same time, she does it anyway. That to me is a really subtle sentiment and a nuanced perspective that I don't think you could earn without building up to it the way that she does so deftly throughout this book. Some further references and reading. I have one interview that I really love with Renata Adler. It's from later in her life, but she reflects on a lot of her work and writing as a craft and a practice, which I will link down below. I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, which is her second novel. It's the only other piece of fiction she ever wrote. It's called Pitch Dark. I don't like it as much as Speedboat. I think when I was reading Speedboat, one of the things that I asked myself after I finished the first time was, how is she going to do this again? Or where would you take this concept? Where would you take the idea of fragmented narrative in a different book, essentially, without making it feel repetitive? And one of the questions I asked myself is whether or not she would maybe naturally feel like there was a way to integrate narrative into her fragmented style of prose. That's kind of what Pitch Dark is. It feels like her attempt to still write in a fragmented way with these little pockets of observation and life happening, but also start to thread through recurring characters, recurring circumstances, plot points, the idea of cause and effect. And I don't think it works as well. And the reason is because it feels stuck in between both worlds. When it's fragmented, it doesn't feel confident enough in its fragmentation to earn that. And then when it's narrative, it feels too fragmented still and doesn't feel necessarily committed to that style of writing either. And that in between makes it feel a little bit less potent than Speedboat. That being said, if you like Speedboat, I think you would probably like this. It's more of her great writing, and there is one section in the middle that I think is absolutely fantastic, which is a whole narrative where the character in this book, which is also, I'm assuming, quite autobiographical, gets stuck in Ireland. And it's maybe worth it even just for reading that section. The next book I'll point to is a book that I actually don't like very much, but I think my distaste for it is subjective, and I've heard a lot of people talk about this in a very complimentary way and say that they love it, which makes me think that maybe you would like it too. This is The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. He was a Portuguese writer. This is a collection of his writing that was gathered and released after his passing. If I remember the story correctly, I think that they found all of this writing in the trunk of his car, and it had never actually seen the light of day until somebody discovered it and decided to release it in this collection. It's also really fragmented. This is not a narrative novel. This is a collection of aphorisms more than anything. There's a lot of great reflections on feeling lost and desperate, and also feeling like you don't want to participate in this world of progress and doing. I think there is definitely some relationship here between what Adler is doing. The next one is another favorite of mine. It's White Noise by Don DeLillo. This isn't necessarily that similar to Speedboat. It is a narrative novel. A lot happens in this book, but at the same time, I think DeLillo does have a very loose way of approaching structure, and his movements through time and space sometimes feel a little bit fragmented in a way that obviously is more conventional than what Adler is doing, but nevertheless still kind of experimental. These are the collected stories of Grace Paley. I would point to her not so much because she is a fragmented writer, but she does like to experiment like Adler does, although in a different way. And she's also a New York writer. She has an amazing sense of language that is a lot more colloquial and vernacular than Adler. I think where Adler is, let's say, more a representation of the intelligentsia, Paley is very much a representation of the working class woman. And finally, Clarice Lispector. This is The Passion According to G.H. She's a Brazilian writer. She is incredibly experimental. She was a naive writer in the sense that she taught herself how to write, did not take any classes, and her approach to the craft is pretty singular. The way that she uses language is phenomenal. It's really sharp and explosive and experimental and odd. If you're into the more philosophical side of Speedboat, then this is definitely something you should check out as well. If you want to read my write-ups about any of the books I mentioned, any of the other books that I'm reading, you can head to my website. And thanks for watching.